Hi guys, and welcome to episode 1 of the In the Hub podcast with me, Neil Thackett. In this episode, we're going to talk about the history and the future of news broadcasting with industry expert John O'Loan. For those of you who don't know our guest today, John O'Loan is, in a way, one of the most renowned personalities in the field of satellite television. For more than 25 years, John has been helping to lead media operators into changing their culture and their content to take advantage of new efficiencies, markets and opportunities. Responsible for the launch of Sky News in the UK, Europe, Africa and Asia, he has since gone on to lead the development of more than 30 different media brands and digital platforms. He is also a founding partner in the IO Media Group. So, welcome John, how are you today?
Very well, thank you, and good afternoon or evening everyone.
We'll get straight into the questions if that's all right with you then, John.
Yeah, sure.
Brilliant. So we'll start off with, how do we measure today's news consumption? And does this differ from how it has been done in the past?
Well, it all depends how far you want to go back. I mean, back in the 70s even, measurement was done either by the number of newspapers that were sold on street corners and over the front fence. And that was a relatively simple job to count up. And of course, broadcasting was measured by ratings, which back in those days were done by diaries, which were not entirely accurate, which is why subsequently we moved to, in the broadcast sphere, data retrieval from meters, which are more accurate, but and statistically valid as they represent, they physically are a cross-section of society, but they represent the entire of society when you multiply them by the magic numbers. Of course, today we're into a completely different environment. While ratings are still done by diaries in some countries and predominantly meters in the West. Digital social media and web apps and web pages are all measured exactly the same way that newspapers used to be measured. That is by exactly how many hits, as we call it today, or how many hits the newspaper boy used to get in the old days when he threw it over the fence, because you know exactly when somebody clicks onto your website or clicks onto your app, you know exactly how many people have done it. So it's far more accurate than it used to be, because it's not taking a cross-section of the community and multiplying by the magic number. It's the real number. So comparing television ratings with actual numbers according to social media and apps and web pages is an extrapolation, but pretty much now, after so many years doing these things, we've got some pretty accurate figures no matter which way we do it.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, yeah, the metrics with websites and social media and stuff like that nowadays, you get a much clearer picture, don't you, of you know, who and how many people are kind of consuming the news.
Well, that's one of the reasons why Google, for argument's sake, has the digital media has taken over the advertising money from traditional media, is because when you advertise on Google, you know exactly who you're talking to, because at some stage they've already filled out a form to say, even with their service provider, they say who they are, where they live. You know a lot more about the person consuming your advertising and the rest of your media, whether it be news or entertainment. You know a lot more about those people because there is a background to them that meters and, as I say, in some places, diaries just can't tell the advertisers. So the advertiser knows exactly what they're paying for. As one famous advertising executive once said, I know that half the money I spend in advertising is wasted. It's just that I don't know which half. The difference today is they know exactly who they're getting to, and they know exactly even whether that person is actually bothered to buy the product or not. So they're not, they're spending less money than they used to, but for the advertisers, it's far more efficient, which is broadcasting's problem. I must say that broadcasting is overcoming that as well, because there are new technologies that have been available for a long time, but they're only just starting to be used, really, which provide advertisers with far more detailed information about the people who are consuming the product on broadcast.
So carrying on from that, how do you think that data is changing the way that we tell stories online?
Well, the first two words that come to mind in answer to that question is clickbait. Because there is so much emphasis now placed on the number of hits that websites and apps achieve, what the publishers of some of that media, or a lot of that media, or even the newspapers turned apps and web pages, are as concerned, if not more concerned, in arranging their data, arranging their stories so that people will either click on it or click on it more often. You know, it was a truism in television still today, but back in the old days when it had no competition electronically, was if you can get twice as many people to watch twice as many people to watch a program, you will double your ratings. If you get them to watch twice as often, you'll double your ratings. And if you can get the same number of people to watch for twice as long or twice as often, you quadruple your ratings. And the same holds true with the digital media today. If you can get the people who are already watching your website or your app to go deeper into it, to stay on it longer, or to come back in 10 minutes time and do the same thing again, you just by very simple maths get 4 times the audience or 4 times the hits. So that's how data is changing. There is a lot of research that goes into whether it be the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or suburban newspapers in Britain. They are doing a lot of research into how people use apps and web pages and how to actually target their audience, because it's a more fleeting audience. It's once upon a time in newspapers and broadcasting, you could rely a lot more on habit. As I saw it described the other day, muscle memory, which accounted for a lot of the ratings that were achieved prior to this era, and for a lot of the distribution of newspapers and other print. So you would build up, whether it was loyalty or muscle memory, there was a consistency of audience and a consistency of interest, and you would have to do something pretty terrible to get people to drop what you were doing or to change the station or cancel their subscriptions. Now, in the double-edged sword for digital media is that it's a lot easier to move to the next, to move to BuzzFeed from Twitter or whatever. So, and then you've lost them. Once they disappear from your orbit, you have trouble getting them to come back again. So that is a lot more volatile now than it used to be.
So how have you seen journalists responding to the mobile revolution?
Well, talking about news specifically, I mean, previously, just now, we've been talking about media generally and not just specific journalism or news, but specifically on journalism and news, there are fewer journalists employed now because, you know, even Google News or Apple News doesn't employ many journalists. They don't do their own reporting. They aggregate what other people are doing. So to that extent, they're using other people's money to provide content for nothing. They certainly are providing a service, and what they would say is, and it's true actually, that if they can place a story, just like clickbait, if they can place a story in front of people who had disappeared from that website or had no intention of ever going there or whatever, if they can get that that masthead, whether it be radio, television, newspapers, or digital media, if they can get a new audience for that masthead, if they get people to click onto that website, well, they've done them a service. And as Google would say, or Apple would say, and that's cost them nothing. But what it has done, it has seen a terrible decline in newspapers, terrible decline in investigative journalism, terrible decline in local reporting, which the industry is still trying to grapple with until there is everyone is looking for the magic pill that is going to reverse that trend. But I think the reality is there's going to be fewer media outlets than there have been in the past. as the international giants take over the finances of how this industry is governed. So journalists are becoming more attuned to not just telling stories in print, but telling stories using all the techniques, all the tools that they have before them, which they could actually do if they did have a phone box in their street. They could do it in the phone box, but they can actually do in their bedroom cupboard. It is now that easy to not manipulate, but to wrangle data and produce stories. Whereas before it was extremely capital intensive because a lot of money needed to be invested up front in a lot of equipment that was quite complex and very expensive. One of the reasons it's expensive is because they didn't need to produce a lot of it because there weren't that many people publishing information. Now the equipment required is very cheap, so there is no barrier to entry. There is a barrier to maintaining. Once you get in, there is a barrier to staying there because the revenues are lean, as we've just seen during the lockdown. That audiences for news generally, both in the UK and around the world, increased about 40% because people wanted to know what was happening, etc. So there was peak interest. As I said, it was up about 40%, but at the very same time, advertising revenues decreased about 40% because advertisers didn't want to take time or space because people weren't buying things, etc. So it was one of those unfortunate situations where there was just huge demand for the media, but the media's ability to satisfy that demand was balanced against their revenues dropping commensurately.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I tend to see a lot more journalists kind of interacting with communities on Twitter during that time as well, and kind of producing this kind of short form journalism through tweets and short videos and stuff like that, just to keep people updated. But as you said, yeah, the kind of advertising revenue just wasn't there, was it?
No, and you need your advertising revenue or your subscription. You need some kind of revenue coming in to maintain that, increase it and expand it, and increase the quality of it. You may be lucky enough, like The Guardian, to have a charity looking after your finances, a trust. But they're few and far between. Like the New York Times, they've got money behind them because they have been very successful in their digital subscriptions and their digital reach. But you've got people like suburban newspapers in Britain who were used to covering local council elections, covering local personalities, local politics, and doing extremely valuable and worthwhile journalism into keeping them on the straight and narrow. And as we say, speaking truth to power, even if it's in a local council. That happens to some extent, but not to the same extent it used to, which is a terrible loss, and we haven't yet worked out how to replace that.
So in your opinion, what are the kind of main approaches in engaging with the news community, past and present?
Well, we used to do a lot of research in years gone by into the demographics of the news audience to find out more about them, to find out what they were interested in, find out what was important to them. I was reading for argument's sake, I was reading some research yesterday which was done on behalf of the Reuters Institute at the University of Oxford. And they have found that in the later stages of the virus, of the pandemic, there's been a huge increase in what we call news avoiders, people who don't want to know what the news is because it's too distressing. Or it's all the same stuff according to them, or it's too boring. And we find, for argument's sake, that in one part of the research that they did, we find that, which surprised me, that probably 20-25% of men could be classed as news avoiders, but the figure is higher for women. Doing that kind of research into the audience has become very important because whereas once upon a time the news at 10 or the 6 o'clock news on the BBC we would have thought was designed for a general audience. More specifically, the 6 o'clock news, for argument's sake, is to appeal to women, whereas the later news appeals to men. So that's always been part of the journalistic conundrum, is to know who you're talking to before you try to tell them anything. Or engage them with anything. And when you get to apps, web pages, social media, and so on, the reality about social media is that it's not one huge audience. It's millions of audiences, which are very small. When you add them up, it's a very big audience. So the idea is, even an influencer may have 1 million followers, but compared with how many people are actually using the medium at that time, it's hard to see, as a percentage. So not so much the cannibalization, but the differentiation of the audience is an important aspect of how we approach what we're doing now, because it's fragmented. When it used to be fragmented into hundreds of pieces, it's now fragmented into millions of pieces. And you have to know who you're after, and you have to know, firstly, whether it's worthwhile going after them. And if you want to be doing it this time next year, because if it's worthwhile, of course, it's important to keep going. You have to have a focus in your mind of who you're talking to, whether you're just drawing them pictures or giving them words, who you're talking to, and why they're interested in it, why they might be interested in it, and therefore why they'll come back again.
Following on from your comments about obviously social media and influencers and stuff like that, from your perspective, what is the effect of the increase in impact of social media on journalism itself?
Well, devastating. Devastating quite often is a negative term, but certainly it means, that the previous landscape has been devastated. In other words, it's changed significantly. What was there before is certainly not there anymore. We will find there'll be fewer and fewer newspapers. We will find that there is less listening to radio and less listening to television, although what is now happening, according to research that I've seen, that people are using their apps and web pages and social media to keep up to date. Now, they might check in with that basically continually through the day, whereas once before they would just watch the news at night, or when 24-hour news channels started, they would less frequently than they do with apps and web pages, but more frequently than they would have with the main evening news, they would check in during the day. And there is people are more up to date now with what's happening hour by hour than they ever were before, because they have the means, and apart from the news avoiders, the interest to do it, which is an interesting part of that research I was just talking about now. Even though there are more sections of the population that may be news avoiders than we thought before reading this research, what the research also finds is that people who aren't news avoiders are actually consuming more news than they used to. So on average, this is why you have to be careful of averages, because there's no such thing as an average person, even by definition. On average, consumption of news is up, but that doesn't mean everybody. And it's who is the everybody, how that breaks down, and why they're doing what they do or not doing it is the key, and always has been the key to getting an audience. But even more so now, and it's more scientific. But fortunately, we have the tools at our disposal to keep track of that, because the very interactive relationship that we have on digital media makes that possible. We might know your name, but we know everything else about you. We probably even know your name, but it's been deleted.
What do you think about social media and obviously the fake news phenomenon and all the kind of things surrounding that at the moment?
Well, this is one of the problems, that the more fragments of news or information or gossip outlets you get, the more the more rubbish you're going to get, along with you're going to get more opportunity to get truthful information. And to a large extent, it comes back to brands. That the whole reason why brands were invented or came into being back in the 1800s was they realized that if you could sell soap that was called Sunlight, and it was always of consistent quality, and it was always a good experience to use Sunlight soap, you'd buy it again. Whereas it was just called soap, you wouldn't know what to buy again. So that was basically how branding came about. And it was a belief in a symbol or a name. And this is really the solution, or one of the solutions, but probably the major solution to the eradication of fake news. That if you have brands that are trustworthy, they are the people that you should believe. And that's why branding such as Sky News or BBC or whatever is very important. Now, of course, the problem is that if you're extreme left wing or extreme right wing, you're not going to trust the ones in the middle, because they're not telling you what you believe to be true or what you think is realistic. So you get Fox News, you get MSNBC, you get The Guardian, you get The Mirror, and so on. And so it's always been a reality in the print world, and it was only inevitable that it should happen in the electronic world as well. The solution to that is to find somewhere in the middle to always tell the truth. As I used to say to the people that I was working with, the only thing we're selling is belief. The only thing that we're selling is credibility. And if we do anything that is going to reduce our credibility, we are in fact selling ourselves short. So, but that doesn't hold true for every media organization, particularly the ones who are just after clickbait, who would quite conceivably just say anything to get clicks. There is a place for those, obviously, otherwise they wouldn't still exist. I mean, the National Enquirer is an example of people who will say outlandish things. I mean, they have been using clickbait since before you had to click to do it. You just pick it up at the supermarket cash register. So the techniques are age old and probably go back to the penny dreadfuls and even before that in the streets of London in the early 1800s. And the solution, I think, is the same thing, that back in those days, people would believe the Times, and they still do. It's a matter of keeping your brand clean. Otherwise, there's, well, to my way of thinking, there's not a lot of reason for doing it if you can't do that. And the risks that you're taking to go the other way are just too great. You might as well get out of the business. So it's a matter of maintaining the key is to maintain a brand integrity and credibility. You will still, from time to time, because we're all human, be a victim of reporting things that subsequently turn out not to be quite accurate. But that's when you quickly, in the process of maintaining the faith of your audience or your readers or whatever it is, that you correct that quickly, and that they do have faith and trust in you, which, if they have faith and trust in you, they're not going to fall foul of fake news.
Yeah. So, I mean, with social media and mobile first dominating everyday news consumption at the moment, like we were talking about with clickbait and stuff like that, how do you think the news industry is addressing the competition with social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter?
Well, it's going after those audiences on Facebook and Twitter and TikTok. Not TikTok.
TikTok. Yeah.
And all of them, including their own branded apps and web pages and broadcast media. What they're having to do is move, if they were exclusively a print brand, masthead, they have had to move into these other areas as well. And a lot of the a lot of the approach there is like we've seen that the Times here in London has started a radio station, and they, which is broadly available across the country. Their stated intention of starting a radio station is exactly the same as their intention of going into, as other newspapers have gone into, Facebook and Twitter and their own apps and web pages, is to go and find the audience as it's moving around, and hopefully that will then reflect back into their main product, and perhaps even in time their main product will start to shift into the new areas that they've moved into. So they're doing that. Each one requires a different approach to journalism, a different approach to telling stories, because it's each different media has characteristics that that you would lose if you didn't try to change some of your storytelling techniques or some of your approach. They also have what used to happen is there used to be very different audiences. Early adopters and younger people were certainly to be found in greater abundance on the internet and on apps. That is now, with more and more people having smartphones, and fewer people getting news from web pages, and more getting them from apps, because it's much easier to use and it's far more portable than a laptop or trying to go to a web page on your phone. We are finding that the audiences for a particular brand are getting to be very similar to if the audience for the Times, it actually in electronic media it skews a bit younger, which is good for two reasons. One is because older people are dying, so you need to refresh the audience, and the other one is that while there is spending power in various demographics, there is more interest in using these technologies or these media more often, and the younger you get. So the reality was about, I guess, 10 years ago, if you're under 45, the way to get to somebody was on apps and web pages, and you could largely forget about television. If you wanted to get to people over 45, well, they'd be watching television. They probably weren't using apps and web pages. Now that is changing, and in the last 10 years, it's moved down about 5 or 6 years. So now it's about 42 to, whereas before it was 45 years of age. So that is changing too, which also means that each individual brand or masthead or influencer needs to realize they're talking to a more broadly based audience than they used to. So they can't be quite, one of the problems is if in any media, if you are very successful with a particular kind of audience, but you need to grow that audience to become more secure. What appeal to the smaller audience, when you get to a larger audience with more demographics involved and more differences involved, how you grow that becomes difficult. And basically that's the challenge of the media that has always been there since, I suppose, they started to paint on cave walls.
Yeah, so I mean, with all of that in mind, do you think that the traditional news industry and these huge organisations can maintain the dominance of their past?
Well, not the same ones, no. I mean, if you look at News Corporation in the UK, they now publish fewer newspapers than they ever have. Well, perhaps fewer than they did when they started. All newspaper circulation is falling. Therefore, the significance of those mastheads, the significance of those publications is much less than it used to be, even though many of the politicians still seem to hold them in the same awe that they used to. And I mean, the reality is that if you just look at the number of brands that no longer exist, media brands that no longer exist, I think that's the answer to the question. New ones will come in to replace the old ones. Facebook and Twitter will continue to say we're not actually a publication, we're just a technology through which publications publish. But in doing so, they have certainly cleaned up a lot of those publishers. They've produced more small ones, but they haven't replaced the big ones yet, and probably won't, because the whole way the market is organized now is far harder to emulate, is far harder to control. I mean, if all you were doing is broadcasting the news, all you needed in the old days was a license from Ofcom or whoever the regulator was. Likewise, even in the United States, anywhere in the world, you needed a license back in the traditional days. Now you don't. And as I said before, that the cost of entry is so much lower because it's so cheap now to get a signal on the air, to get something on Facebook, that the opportunity to have large dominant organizations has passed because the opportunity to control the distribution has passed.
Yeah, 100%. I've definitely been seeing this kind of ever-changing landscape of news broadcasters, especially on Facebook and Twitter. You know, Facebook pages and groups popping up about local news, about certain topics, specific topics and stuff like that. It's been really interesting to see.
Yes, definitely.
So I think that's it for questions, John. So thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule to speak with me today.
Not at all. It's been interesting. A lot of these things I haven't thought of for ages, as you could probably tell.
Yeah. No, it was brilliant. It was really good, really insightful. So, I mean, just to finish off with, what are you up to at the moment? Are any exciting things in the pipeline?
Well, yeah, it's a continuation of what we've just been talking about, actually, that in many respects, the media came to a crossroad during the pandemic, particularly during the lockdown, when a lot of the established broadcasters or publishers had a problem in that they couldn't use their offices because of distancing, or because people were ill, because running people together in a newsroom the way we were used to running newsrooms was too big a risk. So they had to, in fact, become a cottage industry once again, which meant that the technology, which by then was available and proven, was pushed into service so that a particular news program may have been done in what used to be all done in a control room with 4 or 5 people all together in the same room, would be done in 5 or 6 different houses, possibly hundreds of miles apart, using cloud technology and IP technology and broadband and so on. So while we were moving in that direction since last year, and there again, the equipment required there isn't a lot of expensive, heavy, floor space consuming mainframe computers and so on. We are now on the verge of a new era of dissemination of news, whether it be on Facebook, Twitter, which is, I said before, a publication conduit rather than a news brand in itself. So that production has become more software based, and the traditional silos between the story creation and the technical content production have been torn down. It's simply not possible to work in a linear fashion and sequentially churn out enough content to fill all the needed channels in a timely manner. Now, we've only just come to realize this on a general. I mean, there have been people like LNS, like Live News Systems, who've been saying this for about 2 years. But generally speaking, the industry or the world at large has only just come to realize it, and it was the lockdown that created this. While parts of the television production setup have started to adapt, the control room is still arguably the laggard that offers scope for massive and easily implemented improvements. Or in other words, because of the scale, depth and sophistication of automation systems and newsroom computer systems like LNS, the requirement for having 5 or 6 different people come together to lead with their expertise to, at that time, live produce a combined product doesn't exist anymore, which means that the ease of producing these programs becomes greater, which means as far as journalism is concerned, I mean, what has happened over the last 30 years that as computers became more and more involved, but in silos, because the computer systems that we use for newsroom production were different to the computer systems that were needed for web pages and apps, because they just didn't talk to one another. So you had silos of 3 or 4 different groups of people, all under the same brand or masthead, trying to produce similar kind of content for different media, but not being able to do it together. Also, on top of that, we had journalists whose job it was to be data wranglers and spend more time doing what the computers wanted than doing the journalism. What we now find, particularly with LNS, if you can order a pizza online, you can work LNS, that the technical requirements of the output are taken care of within the computer system, so that the journalists can get back to being journalists again, that you can put more people on the road, you can have more fact checking. And now this comes just at the very time where it's becoming harder and harder to get more journalists on the road or to get more journalists fact checking. So what we are doing at LNS is freeing up those people who have an experienced journalistic outlook, and making them journalists again, not computer operators. So software-defined visual storytelling is the premise that integrated the power of computers, software, and networks can not only change the technical aspect of video production, but by improving the way stories are spread, alter the dynamics of content creation, which means at the very time that journalism in particular is at the crossroads, there is light at the end of the tunnel. And I would say this, wouldn't I? But we've been working on it for some time. And in many respects, we've been working on it for more than 30 years. LNS is the light at the end of the tunnel.
Who can benefit the most from LNS?
More immediately, the most is the audience, whether the audience is watching on smartphones or surfing through web pages. It'll be the audience that benefits most. But I think more immediately it will be the journalists who can get back to being journalists again.
Yeah, 100%. I could see that. So if people want to get in touch with you about LNS, where can they find you?
Right here. I'm going to tell you where here is. It's my email address is John, my name, John, at Live Systems, which is the first 2 letters of LNS, Live Systems, one word, .io, LIVESYSTMS.io. Or our website is almost the same. It's www.livesystems.io. And you can get in touch with me that way and we can continue the conversation.
So definitely check that out. Once again, thank you very much, John, for taking the time out to speak with me today. It's been really insightful.
Thank you very much for having me.